And a good Monday to everyone who is joining us and who'll get a chance to enjoy the journey as we navigate some interesting waters today. Because, and I always say I'm fired up for our leadership and coaching segment because every guest has been outstanding. But I had a pre-segment conversation about a week ago with our guest, and just based on our conversation, I knew that there was going to be some great value, but more importantly, I'm going to get an opportunity to grow and learn because she knows her stuff. And again, I'm fired up. So, Dr. Chantale Lussier PhD, mental performance specialist, founder and CEO of the Elysian Insight. I think I pronounced that right, Elysian.
Good.
I hear Elysian, and the first thing I hear is Russell Crowe in Gladiator. Chantale, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me on. And that's such an interesting image that comes to mind because certainly Elysian insight, it means as if inspired by the gods. And of course, one of the references of that word is Les Champs-Élysées in France.
Okay.
And so interesting that gladiator and that sort of image came to your mind. I love it.
Well, thank you so much for making time. We were going to do it last week, but me thinking, my 54-year-old self thinking I was 25, went for a run and tweaked something in my knee, and it takes me longer to recover. And so we had to reschedule. So thank you for playing host to a new segment, a new date. And I'm excited because as a former athlete, I didn't understand how to prepare myself mentally for competition. It was sort of a haphazard, figure some things out on the fly,
Yeah.
and I want to get into that. So, but before I do, let's talk about what you do because you have an impeccable resume: NHL, CFL, NHL, Hockey Canada. Uh, as in terms of competition, the Winnipeg Royal Ballet.
Yeah.
Let's get your story.
Thank you. I so appreciate it. And by the way, I'm glad to hear that you're doing a little bit better because certainly when we injure ourselves, it's no fun. So I'm glad to hear that this week you're better. So thanks for making time for me today. As far as my story, I mean, my sport was dance. And so I was a professionally trained ballet dancer. I was lucky enough to get accepted into the Royal Winnipeg Ballet and to go and pursue my professional training career there. But like many athletes, I ended up getting injured. So I had a back injury resulting from a car accident. And so at some point, like many athletes, I was at a crossroad. Do I try to recover from that injury, or do I pivot and do a career change? I ended up deciding to pursue dance education, and in the process ended up actually still performing and having a 12-year career, both as a dance educator, as a performer, performing on stage and film and television. And so that was my first career.
Right.
But of course, as you well know, as athletes, at some point or another, there's another transition along the way. And for me, eventually I decided to go back to school. And it's interesting that you say you kind of learn on the fly how to mentally prepare, because by the time I went back to university, I was doing my undergrad in psychology, but I was taking all my optional courses in human kinetics. And that's where I tripped into sports psychology. And as a former athlete and dancer, I was like, oh my gosh, if I knew this then, I think I would have had a very different journey. Not only would I potentially have performed even better, but I know for a fact I would have mentally and emotionally suffered less and probably enjoyed it a whole lot more.
That's amazing. You would have probably become more efficient because you
Yeah.
wouldn't spend a lot of time running in a certain direction. And I almost equated to I was going two steps forward, two steps back. But the challenge for me was that, and I'm not sure if it was the same for you, and let me know if it was. I was a pretty good athlete, and I got away with being a pretty good athlete.
Yeah.
I did not until I got to the pros when the competitive level increased and the margin for error was really narrow. Where now you had to figure some things out and be a sort of elite mind and elite body. So I wasn't prepared for that right up until it took me two years of my first in the CFL where I figured some things out. But you had training and you had instructors. Did they take you through that sort of mental preparation, and or was that something that you had sort of had to just do what they say? When they say jump, you just jumped and that was it?
100%. And it's so interesting to hear you say that, because if I step back to my dance career, the
Right.
psychology of dance back in my day was not talked about at all. And even now, there's pockets where that work is happening, but it's still very limited, where we actually talk about the psychology of performance and where people actually get trained in it with the same rigor that they get their technique and their physical strength training, and that they train their bodies. It's just, it certainly wasn't talked about back in my day. So if, for example, you had pre-performance jitters, I mean, you were kind of on your own to figure out, what is my pre-performance routine?
Yeah.
How do I self-regulate my body? What should I be thinking about or not thinking about? And nobody was guiding you with the skills required to do that effectively. And then, even, in pro sport, it's interesting that you say that, because when I first started to work at the pro level, for example, in the NHL, I remember the first team talk I did in an NHL context. I was frankly at that point expecting that people would have some experience of sports psych, that they would have at some point had either some team talks or one on one.
Mm.
And when I asked people to raise their hand in an entire room, for multiple groups, I had either one or two people raising their hands. And so here are high performance professional athletes who are obviously incredible performers, having developed incredible things in terms of their talents and their skill set, technically, tactically, and physically,
Right.
but where the mindset hasn't yet been developed to actually match that. So I was like, okay, let's roll up our sleeves. We've got some work to do here.
That's amazing too, because how old would you have been when you got to Winnipeg?
I actually, in dance, we do start training professionally quite early. So I moved when I was 17 years old.
Wow.
Yeah, and I mean, I think back, it kind of makes me think of hockey players, for example, who
Junior
billet
hockey player. That's what I
exams.
first thought of. Junior hockey players. You're drafted at 16. All of a sudden, you end up in Saginaw or
That's,
someplace. Your
yeah,
world's been turned upside down, and now you're just so uber focused in that one lane.
that's right. And for me at 17, I had finished Ontario grade 12.
Right.
And so I was considered post secondary, which meant I wasn't living in residence. So all of a sudden, 17 years old, I was signing my first lease for an apartment. And all of a sudden, having to figure out a whole lot of life skills, let alone the mental skills to support this big transition I was having in my sport at the time.
Now, where did you grow up?
I grew up in the Laurentians in Quebec.
Okay.
Yeah,
In
and
terms
actually,
in terms of lifestyle, and when you disconnect from family, disconnect from friends and all your social circle, because you're all your high school in, and even from the other uh, men, young women and young men who are training and dancing, and all of a sudden now you end up with the elite of the elite, best of the best in Winnipeg.
mhm.
And not a knock on Winnipeg, but it's a bit of a different place.
Huge. I mean, growing up in the Laurentians, especially before my dancing days,
Yeah.
I was always out in nature. In the winter, it was all about downhill skiing and speed swimming and synchro swimming. And in the summer, it was water skiing and more swim competitions. By the time I was a teenager, I lived here in the region, in the Ottawa-Gatineau region, and that's where I got my foundational dance training. And then all of a sudden, 17, Winnipeg, I'm in the prairies where the winters are very cold.
Portage in Maine,
Yeah,
Portage
that's
in Maine,
right.
the
Win-
windiest part of Canada.
You bet. You know your Canadian, your Canadiana very well.
Well, I remember we had stayed. We played an Eastern Conference game against the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. I hate to go off track, but we're playing the Bombers, the Eastern Conference final, and it was so windy at the Westin because it's right at Portage in Maine, and we were staying at the hotel at the same time as New Kids on the Block were going to be performing at the Winnipeg Arena, and my roommate was Lee Knight, and their lead singer is Jordan Knight. So the
Hmm.
phone was ringing all night of these prepubescent girls looking for Jordan Knight. And we woke up in the morning on game day and looked out the window, and there's like 3,000 kids out front.
I actually remember that because I was living in Winnipeg
You
during
had been
those.
in Winnipeg at the
Yeah,
time.
and so I
Wow.
actually remember when that made the news. That was huge.
You finish. You don't necessarily finish and cold turkey transition from dance as you start to educate yourself. Um, how tough was it eventually moving away from dance? It was tough for me to leave football because I was dancing with the devil I knew
Yeah.
versus the devil I didn't know on the other side of that because I was so defined by football. Did you go through a bit of a transition? Was there a challenging period for you?
Huge. And I so appreciate you bringing that up because
Yeah,
certainly now a lot of my work with athletes will include transitions, right? As we
that's
know,
true.
there's so many transitions within our sporting journey, but then of course there's a big transition into other adventures post athletic career. For me, it was interesting because on one hand, like a lot of athletes, I started to do my university studies while I was still coaching
Okay.
dance, and I was still performing a little bit. So I was, I think, mentally starting to prepare.
Okay.
But I remember when I graduated undergrad and then I moved to Ottawa to do my graduate studies, and I was officially retiring from teaching dance and from performing. And at one point during my master's, I went back to teach a little bit. I think I was missing it, and I was kind of like, is this really my new life? And I was missing this. And so it took a while. It took a few years of getting into my new domain, getting more knowledgeable and excited about that, to slowly be able to kind of let it go. But I'm a very nostalgic person. So even now, I still have days where I think of my dancing days and reminisce about some special times. So it's a big transition. It takes time.
So there you are, a student,
Mhm.
and what were some of the immediate revelations you may have experienced when you got to school? Because you're watching instructors teach, essentially coach a class.
Yeah.
Um, did you look at them as an instructor? You look at them as a coach, and do you learn more from, or maybe just as much from bad coaches as you do good coaches?
Very interesting you asked that. And can I just ask, do you mean specifically, for example, coaching in dance, or once I was in university, those instructors?
I think those actually, we can do both. Let's go with the dance instructors first, because you go in with an innate sense of trust. They haven't earned that trust. You have to give them that trust, because if you don't, you're not going to survive,
Totally.
right?
In dance, and this is one of the things I've learned in sport too. Every sport sort of has its own culture, right? And even in academia, there's a stream of studies on sports sociology, because every sport has its own subculture.
Mhm.
And dance certainly has its own, which means all the good things and a few bad and ugly things too.
Yeah.
um in my case, one of the things I loved about dance was how diverse and international it was.
Right.
And so, one of the things I loved, for example, in my training of the Royal Winnipeg Ballet, is we literally had instructors that came from all over the world. And so, even though sometimes language was a bit of a barrier,
Right.
of course, in dance, the nonverbal body language, you get past that, and it was incredibly rich in terms of education. One of the things that was more challenging in the dance culture was very much the old school mentality. And it was very much negatively oriented, the kind
Okay.
of coaching, or I shouldn't say globally, but predominantly, the kind of coaching was very much critically based. You pretty much never heard compliments,
Okay.
or you're on the right track, keep going. You didn't hear that kind of like constructive, positive feedback. It was really much more, you either got ignored or you got quote unquote picked on. And the narrative was oftentimes that it's, you're lucky to get picked on because that must mean you're good. So
Yeah.
it wasn't always healthy. It wasn't always optimal. And of course, with dance comes a whole caveat of psychological potholes that you can trip into, from low self confidence to body image stuff, um, to to interesting power dynamics between coaches and students. So yeah, each sport I think cultivates certain strengths and has a few things where we could enhance the culture of excellence.
So there you are now, a student, and instructors are there teaching you.
Mhm.
And obviously, for the most part, professors in university are far more liberal,
Yes.
and they don't demand as much. It's not like dance where, okay, jump how high. Now it's, listen, you're here, you paid for school. If you study, great. If you don't study, I don't really care. I'm still getting a paycheck, and I'm going to teach. What was that experience like for you? And also, before I forget, was there an aha moment for you when you go, I'm in my right place in my right time now in school, so it's okay now to let go of ballet?
Yes. Honestly, I was blessed in Winnipeg, going to the University of Winnipeg, which is a smaller university. And so, even in undergrad classes, I think my biggest class was Intro Psych 101, where we had about 75 students. And that was my biggest class throughout undergrad. So, I mean, you compare it to other universities, that's so small, right? But my average classes in undergrad were anywhere from 25 to 40.
Yeah.
And so your professors actually got to know you by name. And I was very blessed that on the sports psychology side of things, I had a couple of really positively impactful professors in Dr. Cal Botterill, who's
Uh-huh.
done a lot of work, including in pro sport and the NHL, as well as Dr. Tom Patrick, who's done a lot of work in high performance sport and internationally. And so they were two very positively impactful figures. And they not only taught sort of formally in the school system, but they also would set up communities of practice and dialogue where we could actually learn and exchange in informal contexts that were incredibly rich. And so, kind of to your point, all of a sudden I came to know the people in those communities of practice, some of them fellow students at different levels. And all of a sudden, it was like meeting your tribe, other like minded people who were high performers in their own sport. And all of a sudden, we're all passionate about the psychology, the human being trying to excel. And definitely along the way, there were a lot of aha moments of like, I have found my tribe. I'm with like-minded people, and I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it.
I love that because like William Bridges wrote the book Transitions and discussed how if you want to go on to something new, something new to take life, you have to let something go. Something has to die, and sometimes it's tough to let go. I remember when I first went to university in that Psych 101 class.
Yeah.
I remember getting the textbook, and it's like this, right? And every chapter I read, I was going, okay, that explains that stage of my life. Okay, that explains why I did this. That's why I almost got arrested doing that. It was all psych. And I'm thinking, I'm going to be a psychologist, not realize that everybody in the classroom was going through the same book going, oh, I did that. Oh yeah, that's the reason why I had this relationship with my mom, and my dad. It's such a revelation. And it had to be that way for you because then you went, okay, now I understand.
Mhm.
And now I can better form my skill set and what kind of coach, what kind of mentor that I want to become based on everything. Good coaches, bad coaches, great professors, bad professors. And that had to be so empowering for you.
It really was. And again, I feel lucky with some of those professors I had. And I feel honestly blessed that I was bridging between clinical psychology and human kinetics, because I was getting all the foundational deep psych knowledge that I really needed to have a strong foundation of understanding of what are human experiences like, right? Developmentally, family relationships, and how our mindset evolves. But then I also had the sports sciences as well. Um, and honestly, it was a lot of readings. Like, for example, I'll never forget the first time I read The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho,
Yeah.
which, it's not for nothing that it's one of the most published books in how many languages across the world. There's universal themes there about a human trying to experience a journey and all the transitions along the way. And so yeah, it was a very rich time. And the fact that I was still coaching in dance
Yeah.
while I was learning that, I think
You were able
even
to give back. Yeah.
yeah, well, and even now when because I not only work with athletes, I also work with coaches and teams and leaders of organizations. I think building that knowledge while I was still coaching myself also allowed me to see it both from the athlete's perspective as well as the coach's perspective, and start connecting a lot of important dots.
What's the key to a great coach?
Mm.
I
Well,
know there's so much to it, but your first emotional
yeah.
thought when I ask you that question, what do you think of?
Two really fundamental things, but that I feel are a lifetime's practice:
Mhm.
care and presence.
Yeah. Yeah.
And as cliche as that statement of they won't care what you know until they know that you care, I
Yeah.
think the expression goes something like that. it's fundamental, right? I mean, I've been blessed to meet, whether it's in dance or in sport or in university, many knowledgeable people. But it's really hard to receive, let alone retain information when there isn't a strong relationship and connection, right? So I think when coaches take the time to invest in the relationship with the people,
Yeah.
then the X's and O's, or the lanes on a hockey play, like, it all gets way easier to translate really technical and rich tactical information
Mhm.
because it's built on a foundation of care, trust, and presence.
I think authenticity is so important. And I was
Mhm.
surprised. I had a discussion with Brad Shaw. He's the assistant coach of the Columbus Blue Jackets, former
Yes.
67 captain, former Ottawa Senator captain, great guy. And we had a great discussion for over an hour, laughed, joked, talked hockey the whole bit. But what struck
Awesome.
me was from a preparation standpoint, a lot of coaches I've learned will be X and O's. Okay, now let's look at their roster, and this guy does this guy does that.
Mhm.
Let's be really prepared, almost to the point where they're overly prepared. And he said that as soon as the anthem is done, and they got maybe 60 seconds,
Mhm.
that's when he starts addressing his defense core because he coaches the defenseman. He says, okay, we got to be careful. This guy's fast. That guy's solid. This guy, that. So there wasn't a big preamble pregame. Let's study our opponent. It would, because he didn't want to make it about them. He wanted to make it about one, their skill set, and to create a different type of relationship that was founded in trust. Trust that I'm going to share this information for you, but I also going to trust you and know that you're going to be able to navigate this water because you're just great athletes. And we
Completely.
can over sometimes prepare to a point where an athlete has become so system driven and not driven by athleticism.
Yes. Well, and there's so many pieces we could go into from my perspective, from what I'm hearing you say. Like, on one hand, I love I love the example you shared, because if we've done the great work all week long,
Mhm.
for how many weeks, for how many months, we have hopefully built some really trustworthy relationships
Yeah.
between athletes and coaches and amongst teammates, that on game day, we just get to work and we focus on the right things because we've already invested in those micro moments that have added up into a really trustworthy relationship. If we're still having to do that on game day, well, now it's making it difficult to
Yeah.
actually focus on the task. Um, on the mental skills perspective, one of the things I'm hearing that you said that's so interesting to me, and it totally supports optimal performance in my books, is that kind of like 60 seconds before puck drop, it's helping those athletes be externally focused,
Yeah.
not in their heads.
Yeah.
But an actual puck is about to drop on an actual ice.
Mhm.
We don't want to be internally focused. We want to be externally focused. And those cues from that coach totally facilitates that transition into an effective mindset for game.
See, the funny thing is when I got to the pros, everything was so internal. I was so afraid of making mistakes, and I was so focused on preparing and trying to know so much to a point where you know I was overwhelmed. And
Yeah.
it took me 2 years to say, okay, just put on your football equipment. Trust that you know what you're doing. Trust that you're going to recognize stuff that's happening out there at 100 miles an hour, and that you're going to be able to make those sound decisions to help yourself be successful, help your teammates be successful. And um, John Tortorella is interesting. There's a great video I'll share with you. Uh, it was a game one of the playoffs, and they were down 3-0. And
Mm-hmm.
the Tampa Bay Lightning. And Tampa was number one in the league. Tampa had the greatest, best power play. They had all these. And after the first period, it's 3-0. And Tortorella went in there, and he didn't make it about the score. He didn't make it about Tampa. He made it about them and remind them how great they are. And he said, just stay with it. Stay with it. And they scored their first goal to make it 3-1. And you're still thinking 3-1. Some in hockey say that's the most dangerous lead you can have. I agree. But 3-1 with a healthy mindset and wiping the slate clean, say let go of that first period,
Totally.
that's a very light challenge versus you guys suck, we're horrible, wake
Yeah.
your asses up, all negative, negative. So they get back out there gripping the stick tight. Now that 3-0 lead feels like it's 6-0.
Mm-hmm.
And again, to be able to say, just breathe and let's go.
Well, and this is where we ourselves can sometimes be our own worst enemy,
Yeah.
or certainly in a team environment, whether it's amongst teammates or certainly in a communication with coaches,
Mhm.
we sometimes inadvertently are our own worst enemy. And we've actually defeated ourselves before we've even faced our opponent. But the story you speak to, again, is so powerful because it reminds us the very fundamental things of stick to the process. You know how to do this, and all of a sudden the wind is at our back,
Yeah.
and we're not getting caught up in an internal negative series of self-talk that's just going to further cloud our vision from the puck, from the play, from the game relevant information, right? And that's I would think that's one of the great favors that Coach Tortorella would have done in that moment, is that if anybody was going internal and having that negative self-talk, he just put a stop to it right there.
Yeah.
By changing that narrative and getting them to just refocus on the good work that of course they're able to do, and change the story.
Well, so let's take this now, your experience from the arena, from the field,
Yeah.
and let's take it to regular Joe Schmo and people out there surviving. We're dealing with a global pandemic. We're dealing with political leadership that's all over the place, that's threatening and leaving us to a point where we wake up and the first thing in the morning is angst, angst, angst.
Yeah.
What tools, what can you share with that person who's not an athlete to allow them to navigate, to get through successfully what they're dealing with today?
It's such a great question. And of course, there are many, many tools.
Mhm.
I think in terms of, what's a useful mental compass
Uh-huh.
before we even pick the strategy, I would go back to attentional focus.
Okay.
And in sports psychology, for example, there's a theory on attentional focus that talks about 4 different kinds of focus. You can either be internal or external, broad or narrow.
Yeah.
And as soon as you kind of know, okay, that's one way, that's almost one mental remote control I can have with my brain, I can now pick strategies that are going to be more effective. To come back to your example, pandemic.
Mhm.
If my mind is broad, external, I'm surfing the internet, I'm on Twitter, I'm exposed to everything trending, to all
Yeah.
the bad, I'm in an external, broad mindset. And no wonder that becomes really overwhelming, right? So all of a sudden, maybe we decide, okay, I'm not going to have right now 20 tabs open on my laptop.
Right.
That focus is too broad. I'm going to go to 1 or 2, whatever I actually need in this moment. And then we actually right away decrease the bandwidth of external input, right? Because we've gone from a broad external to a narrow external. And maybe we can actually focus on one thing, even the news, but one piece of news at a time, right? At times, though, I think it's really important. And right now we have the opportunity at home to even 2 or 3 or 5 minutes at a time to take a little mental break. And then we can actually go internal, right? So whether it's a more spiritual practice like prayer, or something like meditation, visualization, journal writing, a practice of gratitude, things like that, where we collect ourselves, we go a little bit more internal or introspective, but we do one of 2 things. Either we're helping to nurture the good thoughts and feelings that are helping us,
Yeah.
or we actually sit with, make space for, honor, and then move through and declutter the harder emotions, the harder thoughts, because they're there, right? So we also don't want to completely ignore them, but each strategy is going to have its own place and time, right? So I would almost first use the analogy of external versus internal focus as step 1. Do I need to be externally focused right now? Right now I'm having a great conversation with Ken. I want to be externally focused.
Sure.
Right? But what's happening in the news right now in this moment is irrelevant. So I'm going to make sure that I'm external narrow. Later on, I'm going to go do some meditation, right? And then I'm going to shut down the laptop, remove a few external barriers or distractors, so I can actually go internal and do that good work. So I think that focus compass is really helpful.
Do we have to sort of adapt a little bit, change our ethos, and reset our lines of demarcation.
Tell me a little bit what you mean by that, by lines of demarcate.
Just in terms of, times have changed, and uh, maybe we have to, the warrior sometimes has to say, okay, what am I willing to accept?
Yeah.
I'm willing to accept everything. If I have 20 tabs on my computer going on, and I wake up and I'm looking at Trump stuff and I'm doing this and that, and so you have no lines of demarcation, so you're falling for everything.
Yeah.
And you wake up with a clear sort of purpose-driven ethos that says, today, these are my intentions.
Yes.
And it has nothing to do with stuff that, one, that are unpredictable, and two, we have no control over.
That's right. And this is where, I mean, if I think even some of the themes, whether in some group and team talks I've been doing lately virtually, or if I think of a lot of conversations with family, with friends, and with clients, I really think of three big themes that keep coming up. One of them, kind of to your point, we could just be, in French, we have a great word, girouette, at the top of the barns, the.
Yeah, it turns, yeah.
Yeah, I'm having a French moment here, Ken. But we could just be spinning in the wind, right, to all of the day's events and be very triggered and be on this emotional roller coaster, right? So I think, to your point, it's really important that whether it's once a day or even once a week, that we do have a process of setting our own intentions so that we're not reactive, we're actually proactive. And we might need to do that more often. Maybe sometimes people are like, I set goals once every 3 months, or, I do a to-do list once a week, and maybe that's fine. We might need a little bit more rigor with that process so that we are keeping our own course a little bit more proactively, because there's a lot pulling at us. So that would be one thing I would say, whether it's goal setting or intention, some kind of way where we own the things that are within our control, and it comes from us, right? The other piece, and I think again our conversation so far alludes to it, being at home right now, I think a lot of us are having to adjust and become really aware of, okay, in my home environment, whether there's lovely people or solitude or pets or lots of space or not a lot of space, I think all of us need to kind of really pay attention to what are the sources of energy gains and what currently are energy drains. Because I think that is probably significantly different for people right now than whatever their usual, pre-COVID life was, right? Maybe before, the commute was an energy drain. Okay, so now we don't have that, but there's probably other energy drains currently. What are they, and can we mitigate them? And likewise, what's giving you energy, and can you more proactively put some of that so that you're, again, self-generating the energy that you want to back up your intentions, right?
Isn't that part of our DNA, though? Our ability to survive? And so we have it within us.
Yeah.
I had a good friend in college, and she worked with a Power Within company, and they'd be touring Tony Robbins and Bill Clinton and all these great people. And she said, come out and check out Tony Robbins. Okay. And it's from my athletic background, I've heard so many speeches and coaches and stuff. And I sensed that what Tony was doing, essentially reminding us of what we already have within ourselves, but we haven't necessarily tapped into.
Absolutely. And this is the thing, and I'm not the first one to speak to it. I know it's been written about lots, but it's really the idea, especially when we're talking energy, but also mindset and emotions. It's how can we be a thermostat instead of a thermometer? Yes. Right? The thermometer is just reacting to the environment, reacting to the situation, and it's just giving you a reading. And how often in life, because we're all human, none of us are perfect, how often do we do that? We walk into a space or into a situation and we just react, right? All of a sudden we feel stressed or emotional, but it's literally just in response to the external stuff.
Yeah.
But that internal thermometer that actually sets the course energetically, mentally, emotionally, it's already in us. It's just most of us haven't realized that we actually have the settings.
And I guess we have to go back for a lot of us now, especially with this global pandemic and being at home, we have to get that student hat back on. We have to start be willing to relearn or learn how to go about things a little differently. It reminds me of sort of the Navy SEALs and that 4 color scheme that they use: white, yellow, orange, and red. And white is essentially, it's the 4 stages of learning. That's all it really is you're unconsciously incompetent. So you don't know that you don't know. But then you go to yellow where, oh wait, I don't know. I've realized I don't know. But now that's a step in the right direction, right? Or if someone says, geez, I don't know, that's not necessarily a negative. Now that's an opportunity where, okay, let's go figure it out and hone our craft to the point where you're consciously competent, and then then you're unconsciously, what was it, unconsciously competent, where now you're an expert and you've honed your skills. And we just do that over and over and over again.
Completely. And I mean, the athlete setting is a great example, but it
Mhm.
certainly is not strictly in the athletic domain, where don't we always want to be at the edge of our ability anyway? Don't we want to, if I think
Wait,
of,
do we though? Or is life so comfortable where, I don't know, we've tapped out? Some people look at athletes, for example, and they say, well, you know what? When he was born or she was born, the trumpets from the clouds, and there's this,
just
you destined to be a great athlete, destined to be all these things. Or they fall in love with Tom Brady, who was drafted in whatever round, and all that story. But say, yeah, but that's Tom Brady. He always had it within him. He discovered his greatness. But that's
well,
him. Not me.
I mean, it's an interesting thing. Even if we look at some of the publications, whether it's academic publications or some great books that have come out, the sheer concept of talent has been debated, right? Is it actually something that's innate, to your point, or is it something that's actually coached and trained? I've always been, whether we're talking psychology in general or whether we're talking in the sporting domain, I've always been in the mindset, well, it's both. If you look at someone like Michael Phelps, of course, and biomechanics actually look at this, my hand will never scoop the same amount of water because I don't have the same long limbs. So certainly you look at that and you go, okay, there's a great potential
Yeah.
to create something in a sport that would work well with such long levers, right?
Yeah.
And his cardiovascular capacity and all these other things that have come out in the science.
He would never have been a jockey.
But exactly, that could not work with a horse at all. But likewise, I'd like to give Michael Phelps a whole lot of credit for actually the hours and hours and hours and hours that far exceeds. And I was a swimmer once upon a time, and I say that super humbly. You and I both, our accumulated hours in the pool probably don't even come close to what Michael Phelps has
Yeah.
invested. So I think then we do a disservice. And same thing mentally in terms of, oh, confidence. He or she has always been confident, or they probably worked at it. They're human too.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I harken back to when I realized I had to work hard. I was going to be a great athlete like other guys. And those great athletes back in the day, they didn't fulfill their the goals that they had set because they got so caught up in being talented, but forgot how to work. Where I had some talent, but I had to work hard. I tell my 11-year-old son Elijah, I said, you don't realize this, Elijah, but you have a much better running stride than I ever had, even when I got to the pros. I was so bow-legged and falling apart. I looked like, what's that sheriff in Toy Story? I looked like
Oh,
him
yes. I
trying
forget
to
the
run.
name, but
But with hard work and a bit of belief,
exactly.
right?
And that's where we realize there are multiple factors that go into greatness,
Yeah.
right? I mean, there's often the metaphor even of gardening, if a flower or a plant doesn't, or a vegetable, whatever your garden, if it's not growing, do you actually water the plant, or do you look at the quality of the soil?
Or the
Right.
Yeah, sure.
So I've always been nature nurture. I think it's both. And that applies when we're talking about developing athletic talent, whether we're talking about developing creative
Mhm.
artists that can thrive, or the next set of leaders in a corporation, and in terms of people who can work effectively together, right?
Right.
It's both, who are you and what are you bringing with you, and how can we further develop these things together in a rich soil.
So I'm gonna connect with Chris. Chris is our producer in upstate New York. Nobody can see him because he's behind the scenes doing his job. But Chris, I have that John Tortorella YouTube video. And I'm gonna cue it up and play it. Give me the thumbs up. Can I do that right now by sharing the screen? Okay. So Chantal, I want you to watch that and let me know what you think.
Thank you.
Okay, so where is he here? Now I'll preface it by saying there's some language that a little blue, but okay, here we go. About skills, forget about X's and O's. It's a mindset of believing. It's amazing what can happen. So you stand in there. You stand in there and you don't take a backward step. Not for a second. It's a great opportunity to stand right face to face with him and go right to him. There is no one taking a back step here. Right? Let's be real. There you go.
Love it. Oh, I love it. There's so much. Well, I mean, two main things. Obviously, the idea that how often when we're faced with a big obstacle, it's almost like a reflex with the knee, right? The initial, we want to quote unquote physically and mentally lean back.
Yeah.
But there he is telling his and reminding his athletes, this is, first of all, not a problem, it's an opportunity. That language is vital because it gets you excited, right? Yeah. And then he's literally reminding them, stand there, lean into it. And that's a physical thing, but it's mental too. It's like, it's literally flipping it on its back. So what, we're down. We have an opportunity here. Now we're excited to go out and create a different story. Now we're excited, reminding ourselves that momentum is not accidental. Momentum is something we create, right? And he's saying, you're going to create it by standing there, by leaning in. I love it. I think it's fantastic.
And it struck me as his almost being a parent, a dad, reminding his boy.
Yeah.
Sometimes you got to stand up and you got to lean forward and not take any crap. And usually when you hear a coach use language where he's using blue language, you would equate that with the team being reprimanded for not performing well. But in fact, it was his loving way of reminding his team that we're good. We're good enough. We're not going to beat them at the way they played their game. We're not going to go guns a-blazing. But if we play the way we think we can play to beat them, we will. Now, what was interesting in that series is they won the game after taking the lead. And Brad had said when they got back to Tampa and they won the first two games, when they got back to Columbus, they thought, okay, there's going to be a big pushback. And there really wasn't. And that says something about Tampa Bay's.
Exactly.
And because they had such an easy season and they were dominant, they never had to go look in the mirror. They never had to go back to the whiteboard and say, guys, we just got punched in the face. We got to figure this out because they're going to punch us in the face again.
Yeah.
And so they had no experience with it and they couldn't figure it out. And it reminds me of the Red Blacks when they won the Grey Cup against Calgary. And correct me now, were you working with the team at the time?
Not that year. I was with the team in 2018.
Okay. Well, you remember that Grey Cup game.
Of course. And I mean, 2018, we were Grey Cup contenders. So we did have an appearance at the Grey Cup. So it was a great season.
And they win the cup. They beat Calgary, but they're the prohibitive underdogs going to that game. And they had a great game plan. They trusted the game plan and they had some early success. And they put Calgary in a very uncomfortable place where Calgary had to go back to the bench and say, what are they doing?
Yeah. And
Calgary had no memory, no muscle memory when it came to trying to figure things out in real time. And they made it close, that's for sure.
Yes, it was exciting. I loved the replay recently too.
We saw it, and just the ability to make those plays and trust the process. They could have believed that, we're underdogs, Calgary's dominant, all that kind of stuff. But they didn't. They believed in themselves. And then Toronto plays Calgary here at another Grey Cup, and the same thing happened to Calgary.
Yeah. And the thing too, whether it's the hockey example you bring up, or of course the wonderful football examples that you're bringing up, I think one of the things we don't talk enough about, particularly in sport, is not only the importance of confidence in athletes, but the confidence that coaches have, right? And coaches are in a tough spot, right? Like they're in some respects just as vulnerable as athletes. There's always a lot of rotation and quote unquote a certain level of job insecurity that just kind of comes with working in sport. It is how it is for all parties in the sporting ecosystem, if you will. So it's normal for coaches to feel a lot of pressure. But in those really key moments, can they actually still trust the plan that they planned, the playbook that they created and their tactics? Can they feel confident enough that, like Tortorelli, they actually come out and will confidently communicate that to their athletes, right? And they have to genuinely feel that way. Otherwise, they're just going to start being reactive as opposed to truly sticking to the great way that they can play.
Let's segue that to that intuition,
Hmm.
coaching intuition.
Yeah.
Coaches have a tendency to get married to the game plan
Hmm.
and say, well, it's X and O's. Theoretically, it should work. So work harder, but we're going to keep running the same play. So we're going to keep slamming our head against the same wall, hoping we don't get a concussion on this one. To be able to let go of the game plan, or to get them to execute the game plan, to intuitively say, okay, this guy's going, let's play him more versus this guy who's not going.
Hmm.
Where does intuition play into coaching?
Both in coaching and with athletes. And again, there's variability of what that looks like depending on the sport. But I think, for example, if you think of some of the psychological constructs that are often thrown around in mindset and sports psych world, we often talk about mental toughness, right?
Yeah.
Stay the course. And certainly there's a place and a time where you need mental toughness and you need to stay the course, right? But then there's resilience, and then there's mental agility.
Right.
And I think mental agility is where that ability to quote unquote improvise becomes really important. But now improvise is not just willy nilly, it's not just anything, it's improvisation, as you said, with intuition that's informed by years of knowledge, by training, by preparation. So it's akin to musicians who can improvise with excellence. Right? Who are so attuned to each other that, oh, you played this note, I'm now going to riff this way. Well, can we do that not only on a team, whether it's in sport or in business or in the arts? And can we do that amongst each other as teammates and between coaches and athletes? But also, can we be so well attuned to what the opponent is doing that, oh, you went this way, we're going to improvise that way, just that tweak on the playbook. But it's what makes all the difference, right? It's not random. It's the preparation and the excellence that allows you to adapt accordingly. And to me, that's mental agility. So we need to train mental toughness, but we also need to train mental agility.
But you need to build a history, though. You need to build a portfolio of experiences to be able to draw upon that.
Yeah.
Which I think probably happened for you when you started teaching. There had to be a moment. For me, it was as a coach, it happened to me where I realized I knew a lot more than I thought I knew,
Mm-hmm.
which was a great value.
It is. And
Yeah.
Kind of back to what you were saying earlier about comfort zone versus, we didn't say risk taking per se, but that growth mindset, right? I remember I was still in undergrad, growing my textbook knowledge of sports psychology while still coaching dance.
Right.
And I'll never forget, I started to play around, literally using my dance classroom as a lab. And I was like, I want to add to my toolbox as a coach. And here I am learning these things. So I'll give you one example. We were doing pirouettes, spins, right? And we had this exercise, and my dancers for weeks and weeks had been working on singles and doubles.
Right.
Nobody had done triples. Nobody. And frankly, we weren't really there yet.
Right.
But all of a sudden I'm like, dance studio is the lab. What if I make them do the exercise as is? Then I get them to sit down. I'll still get the pianist to play the song, but now we'll visualize it. And we'll visualize it with triples. Well, it didn't take 2 weeks that half my class was nailing triples.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, to your point of building that portfolio, it's by actually being really thoughtful in how you coach these skills that then you get the data and you're like, proof is in the pudding. This stuff really works. And here's one way that it was impactful for this group. Now, it might be different in another setting, in another sport, but I think as a coach is being willing to, I say play around because there's a creativity piece, but again, it's almost like a scientist in the lab. Let's try this variable. Let's try that.
And I think what happens with the coaches is I think the real passion and the real love for coaching extends from the desire to try to find a way to set someone else up for success.
Yes.
And there's no template. There's
Yep.
no one template, right? It just doesn't happen that way. So you have to find different ways to get to Rome, and uh, you'll be able to say, okay, let's sit down and listen to the music, and let's mentally visualize, but also let's deconstruct it. So we now know in our brain and eventually in our heart that the triple is we shouldn't be as fearful of the triple.
No, because once you've seen it, you know it's possible, right? And then as a coach
Yeah.
in that sport, in dance, I was still giving my technical cues
Mhm.
before the visualization. And so then they were visualizing with, with the hook, with a doorway into that new skill, because visualization is a skill.
Yeah.
But I was giving them a couple of parameters as a coach saying, okay, this week we're really focusing on this and this. So when you visualize, think about those two things. And then we would get back up and do it again physically,
Yeah.
right? And so that's one tiny little example of one mental skill in one specific
Mhm.
sports setting. And so again, the possibilities are endless. It's up to us as coaches and as leaders to see how we can start building that in.
You almost slow things down like that baseball player who's hitting the ball well. The ball looks like a grapefruit. Not hitting the ball well, it looks like an aspirin. So if you
Yeah,
can slow things down and see the board, see the chessboard
yeah,
for what it is, realistic, not what you manufactured in your mind or what you create in terms of a sense of fear or whatever you've attached to that experience.
mhm,
Boy, again, it took me 2 years in football to figure things out to a point where, okay, all the checks and balances I had to go through mentally before the ball was snapped.
yeah,
And my goal, my number one goal as an athlete when I got to the pros for my quarterbacks was I needed them to trust me.
yes.
And that meant I had to really be competent and hone my craft and learn.
And
And
that's an interesting piece right there too, right? The interpersonal in team
and the
sport.
expectations you have of each other,
Yes.
right? And so, yeah, uh,
That's fantastic because trust is huge, isn't it? And again, which piece of that is intrapersonal?
yeah,
Which piece is I have to build my confidence, build my experience, build my competence,
yeah.
as you said, etc. So I have that portfolio, and I myself know I can trust myself.
Mhm.
But then, of course, how do I develop that trust with coaches? How do I develop that trust with teammates?
Yeah.
So that game day, we don't we've done our homework in building those alliances. We now can literally just play.
And you ask so many coaches, you say, hey, coach, uh, what would you prefer on game day? An athlete who may not be as talented but is trustworthy, or an
Mhm.
athlete who's talented but you just don't know what you're going to get? And that athlete's like that knife on the jugular. Eventually, they're going to get right and kill you. And so you either coach that talented athlete and to become competent, or you make the tough decision to say, okay, we need to go with someone who may not be as talented, but is trustworthy and understands the responsibility he or she bears individually and as a member of this group.
Completely. It's interesting. I recently read, I don't know if you've read it, The Culture Code. Great book. I would highly recommend. And they have a lot of different examples from sport, from business, and also from Navy SEALs and special ops. And certainly that comes up over and over and over. If you don't have trust, if you haven't built that in
Mhm.
consciously, not accidentally, but purposefully made sure to build that in, how can you possibly trust each other when the pressure is on?
That's just it.
Yeah. So I mean, all of a sudden we realize to truly excel personally and collectively, there's a lot we need to properly invest time and effort in, and that includes building relationships.
And if you haven't journeyed through your life, be as an athlete or a non-athlete, and you look back and you don't see a million and one experiences that when you go to your memory bank and think of them and recall them, it's almost like they occurred yesterday. If you haven't got that experience, then you kind of spun around in circles and wasted your time,
Yeah.
right?
Well, and we don't want to have experiences where we don't grow and learn, do we?
That's just it. And grow and learn with other people.
Yeah.
And which means you have to be vulnerable. You have to be
Hmm.
authentic. You have to be trustworthy,
Yep.
and you have to be risk averse to climb mountains, go do some mountain climb with other people.
That's right.
And you do that. And that's what all the motivational speakers and that's what they're talking about. Really at the core is how we love our life and how we interconnect and how we can be authentic and care about each other, which is again
Completely.
part of our DNA.
It is. And, it's interesting because whether I'm thinking artistic domains, corporate domains, sporting domains, I think a lot of times we get one of two things right, and sometimes we forget to address both. So either we're really into our processes and we show up in whatever is the work environment, and we know today we're working on projects X, Y, and Z, and we have to do this, 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 and we're very task oriented. Or we're very values oriented, and we know to have a great team, I need to have this trust, and we value that.
Yeah.
But I feel like a lot of times people don't know the how.
Yeah.
How do I go to work building the skills to link the tasks
Mhm.
and those values? And I feel like that's often the gap, is the
And that-
how.
and that's where coaching,
Yeah.
leadership comes into play.
It certainly is. And there's many levels, right? From, as I said, the intrapersonal, which part belongs to me, to which part is in that wonderful ephemeral space
Mhm.
in between parties.
Well, it looks like we've pretty well cured coaching and leadership dilemmas. So
Well, there we go.
the
Hey,
rest of the world can just sleep easy now. Rest easy.
we're now on to solving the world's problems.
And it's only Monday. We
I,
have the rest of the week to solve so many other global issues after today's segment.
I love it.
This is outstanding. Chantale, thank you so much for your time.
Well, likewise, I really appreciate the opportunity to be on and to have a great conversation with you. What a treat, and what a great way to start the week. Thank you.
Now, how do people find you?
Yes, so I have a website,
Okay.
ElysianInsight.ca. So that's ELYSIAN, Elysian Insight. And I've got the website, and I've got a presence on social media. Dr. Chantale Lussier. You can find me on Twitter, on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook.
Outstanding. Now, Chantale with a silent E on the end,
That's
because a lot of
right.
people forget that. I did that about 6 times trying to do some research and stuff, and finally it dawned on me.
Thank you. Yes, my parents decided to be wonderfully creative.
Now, way off record, off the topic, are you Catholic?
Yes, I was born, well, I'm French and I grew up in Quebec. So I grew up in a French Catholic environment.
Same here. So your middle name would be?
I actually don't have one.
What?
Again, my parents were very creative.
Not that creative, because my parents, they named me, you ready? I was Kenneth Russell Joseph Simon Maurice Evraire II.
Wow.
Don't ask. I don't know.
That is
Joseph is my
spectacular.
dad. Maurice was my godfather. Simon, I think, was the mailman. I don't know.
I love it. Honestly, it's funny. Growing up, I always wished I had a middle name. Nowadays, as an adult, I feel like it's simple.
Well, the good thing is if I ever cross the law and get myself in trouble, I always have an alias. So silver lining.
Good to know, hey?
Hey, Chantale, thank you. Enjoy your day.
You too.
And we'll stay connected. And you made me a better coach.
Well, likewise, it's always a pleasure to exchange and to pick each other's brains. So thank you.
Picking our brains and each other's hearts. Outstanding. That's Chantale Lussier PhD. And boy, made me a better coach. I appreciate it and enjoy your day. Moving forward for the rest of the week, I'm actually lining up some other coaches. I'm looking at Paul LaPolice, the coach of the Red Blacks. I'm also looking at a couple other people from my my sporting circle, but I also want to get out of my comfort zone and find some people from different realms and that we can tap into and capture some of their knowledge and make us better coaches and better leaders. But for those of you who joined us, thank you so much. And again, a big thank you to Chantale Lussier. I wish you a safe and an enjoyable day with a clear ethos and the great lines of demarcation, so you don't get caught up in all the junk that's going on right now, so you can enjoy your day with those around you. Much love from the nation's capital. I'm Ken Evraire, and thank you for joining me on this, the Leadership and Coaching segment. Take care.